world's longest running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanaugh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on the show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
Welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yes, indeed, yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh. We're going to talk all about modern data management today. So crawl, walk, run, fly. What does that mean? We've got several experts lined up to tell you all about it, what their thoughts are. Scott Taylor, the so-called data whisperer, is online today. We also have Nadine Francis, the Toronto Star, and Peggy Tsai of a company called Big Idea. And in the background, we've got Danielle Oberdier, aka Daikayo Data, who will be live tweeting. I just saw her and Scott, as a matter of fact, at the Airside event in New York City. That was an absolute blast. We talked all about governance and really about modern data management. And Scott, you were there. Real quick, what were your impressions about the gig, the Airside, the whole thing?
For Eric, thanks for having me back again. Love being here on DM Radio. Scott Taylor, Data Whisperer. Spoiler alert for all you out there. I don't do a lot of whispering. We save that for the data. But it was a blast going to JFK, that iconic terminal, that TWA terminal of my youth, flying 707s when I was a kid, walking through those big, long red tubes. And then we got to go to that event outside on the tarmac in that old airplane. It was just a blast. Also, there was some fun stuff about data going on there too, but I was just enamored with the environment.
And I tell people all the time that invite me to these great conferences, and I'm always thankful that I'm primarily there for the cocktail receptions. At the beginning of the event, at the end of the event, that's the fun part. But you get to talk to people and talk about what they're doing in their lives. And I'm sure data weaves its way into the conversation at some point. And we're surrounded by data these days. And so like the topic today, crawl, walk, run, fly. My take real quick is that crawling is you're doing basic stuff. You're pulling data out of some system. You're in a flat file. You're loading it into Excel and doing some machinations there. If you're walking, well, you're probably getting a bit more sophisticated. You're setting up some scripts maybe to pull data automatically. Classic ETL, extract, transform, load. So you extract it from the source system, you transform it into the format that the schema will match in your target system. That takes some work. I've been doing it for 25, almost 30 years, honestly, in different fashions, mostly with marketing data, emails, name, first name, last name, all that fun stuff, loading these files in. And then you get into the running phase. Well, that gets a bit more interesting. So you're probably trying something called ELT, where you extract and then you load, usually in the cloud, and then you do your transform in there, because guess what? The cloud has a lot of capacity, compute capacity, but also you don't have to strip out the context anymore. We used to always strip out the context because we kind of had to, because we had to fit the data through thin pipes to reach slow processors and expensive storage, and all that has changed. So ELT, you're kind of running, and then flying. That's what I say is some of these really cool vendors are doing now with dynamic data pipelines. Companies like Ascend, companies like DataOps.live, who are at the Airside event, doing really cool things about setting up dynamic connectors between systems so that all the boring stuff is just done automatically. The automation stuff, and that's what gets me excited, Scott, and I think you too, when you think about the business people in our industry, they don't want to have to care if is it ETL, is it ELT, or using Java, who cares? As long as it gets done and they can use it, that's the point, right, Scott?
They absolutely do not care about ELT, reverse ELT. I ran auto AI with reverse ELT, and now my data is running backwards in circles. So I don't really know how that works. But from a business side, I think Fly is you're able to deliver the right content in the right place, the right time, in the right context to move the business forward. And I think of crawling, not from a technical perspective, as you mentioned, on kind of what you do with the data, but the data quality, the data confidence itself. Do you have those foundational elements in place around the most important domains that run your business, particularly brand data and relationship data? When I say relationships, it could be customer, vendor, partner, prospect, consumer, all those different types of relationships you have. Is that stuff well managed? did you get to a point where you can kind of walk that around? Are you running with it in a way that your hierarchies tie out, your reports tie out, and then Fly is really putting all that stuff into the business? So I think there's another stream of this kind of crawl, walk, run, fly terminology about business value and business accessibility and business trust in the data.
That's a great point. And I just had a thought in my mind to run with a metaphor. Sometimes people run with scissors in their hands, right? It's like, whoa, don't go running with the scissors in your hands. All right, be careful with that PII, personally identifiable information. The regulations are really everywhere these days. If you're in California, certainly you got CCPA. When you're in Europe, you've got the GDPR. And big companies that are not careful about their data, that don't button down the processes. And guess what, folks? Automation is one of the best things you can do, especially if you can unwind it, right? I mean, you have to be careful about what you automate, but most mistakes are made by people who are just not paying attention or got distracted or whatever the case may be. It's usually human error that causes trouble, right, Scott?
A really good way to screw up your brand is to release data you shouldn't be releasing, is to not conform to the privacy regulations. And it gets harder and harder. But we've heard story after story in the last years about brands really exposing themselves and damaging their relationships because they didn't protect and guard and steward that data in the ways that they should.
Right. That's exactly right. Well, let's bring in our next guest here and stick around, Scott, for the roundtables. Nadine Francis with the Toronto Star. She was invited by our good friend Danielle. So Nadine, thanks for joining the show, and tell us a bit about yourself and your work and your journey in the data world.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for having me, Eric. So my data journey is probably a little different than many other people. I'm a project manager now with Torstar, which is the major company that owns Toronto Star and 6 other daily newspapers and over 70 community newspapers and various other power brands. So we are very well known in Ontario, Canada. And at one point, about 5 years ago, our CEO decided we needed to become a data company. We still weren't even selling subscriptions online. Everyone was siloed into different things. And as you were mentioning, we were definitely crawling. I don't even know if we were even crawling yet. I think we were just on our backs going like this. Every department was kind of doing their own thing, a lot of errors. Everyone had different numbers. It was a bit of a mess. And at the time I was a research analyst. So we thought we were automating, because we had spreadsheets and we would create our own reports and send them out and nice little PowerPoint presentations. And we thought we were the bee's knees. And eventually we brought in a chief data officer, and he decided to inherit the research team who actually knew how to analyze data. We just didn't have automated data yet. And then he brought in other people who knew how to build the infrastructure. So we started from the ground up, and he decided to build the foundation of what we required to build a subscription model that we could automate, we could report on, and also make sure every team across the company was actually working with the same information. So in the midst of that, I was very interested in project management for many years, and they needed a project manager. So I decided to get my feet wet in that and have been learning ever since. So it's been a very, very interesting journey.
Good for you. And I know from experience, folks, project management is for serious professionals, right? Because you have to kind of map out the project. You have to know the desired end state. That's some of the best consulting I've come across, is when people talk about desired outcomes, right? What do you want to be the case when we're done with this project? Is it a faster time to reporting? Is it improved customer experience? When you have very specific goals, that makes your job a heck of a lot easier, right, Nadine?
Yeah, and what's been interesting is seeing the progression of how our company has been thinking about data, because originally they didn't have that data mindset. So before it was like, okay, what do you want? And they'd be like, I don't know, I just want a report. And now they're actually thinking more strategically about what they want to present and what they're going to use the data for. There were certain departments that didn't want to buy in at all, and now they're major advocates of data. So it's been really fascinating to see the progression of buy-in and acceptance of using data management.
Yeah, that's great. It's wonderful that you have buy-in, and that's a fantastic sign that people who were a bit skittish up front or standoffish have come around. And the key, you mentioned it a couple of times, is that you're all using the same data, so you're on the same page.
Yes.
And you can build some processes around that. And I loved your quote. We thought we were automating because we had spreadsheets. You're not alone. That's not uncommon. But once you figure out the automation, because let's face it, there's a lot of grunt work that goes into doing good analysis. Yeah. And who likes grunt work? I've done ETL. It's not a fun thing to do. It's just something that has to get done. So if you can automate that process and have the audit trail, that's the best case scenario, right, Nadine?
Absolutely. And what I love about our team is we do have we've kind of created 3 streams for ourselves. We have the engineering group. They're very focused on the governance, the privacy, security, also all the ETLs. And then we have our machine learning group and the people who do the visualization. And then we have where I used to work, which was the research and analysis group. And so they just review a lot of this information, making sure that everyone understands what they're looking at, and so that our stakeholders can make sure they're making proper decisions. And so it's been really fun. So.
Yeah, well, good for you. And in the newspaper business, I mean, you folks have come along pretty far, pretty quickly. If 5-6 years ago you weren't even doing online news, and that is a radically different industry now than it was 10 years ago, for sure.
Absolutely.
Let alone 5, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
Are you seeing that your job and what you're doing is really helping the organization identify how to do that better and what services to offer and how to do things? I think we've
left the honeymoon phase now. We were very excited about just getting subscriptions and getting that lifted off. And now we're spending a lot more time trying to understand the churn so we're trying to, I think that's the key now. So we were flying for a few years, and now we kind of moved back to the running part, I would say. We've kind of, we're taking a breath, and then I feel like we're moving to another phase. We're just kind of taking a few breathers here. So we're just running along kind of that leisurely jog, and then we're going to start running again by the end of the year. So we kind of know where we want to go. And with COVID, a lot of things kind of slowed things down. So now we're just trying to reconfirm our direction. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And maybe I'll bring in Scott Taylor just to comment on that. To me, that sounds like a mature organization that got some things done and is now regrouping a bit to figure out what to do next. You got to do that a lot these days, Scott, right?
It's happened. And, COVID actually accelerated a lot of data management activities in a lot of organizations that were thrust into, let's say, e-commerce, and they weren't prepared yet. And they realized all they had was operational product data that they couldn't put on a site in front of possible consumers. And so there was a lot of the analysts that I talked to said that their inquiries around data governance, data stewardship, master data management, my favorite topic, just increased 20, 30, sometimes 40%. So I feel like we're kind of broke through in a lot of cases, because that space, which is where I live and what I love, and that's the only way you start crawling is if you get that MDM right, you get that master data right, is finally, I think, getting its day in a lot of organizations that were just distracted by the sexy BI, AI, data science stuff.
Sure.
And what I like about the title of this session is it is in that order, right? If you want to try and fly before you can actually walk, you're going to be in trouble unless you're a bird, I guess. But really is that order. It's not something where people can skip steps. I guess there's a pun in there without being able to do that work.
Well, and there's a lot of discovery that can be done. I'll throw this over to Nadine real quick before our first break comes up. With keywords, semantics, these kinds of things, that comes in handy when you're talking about news media, because you want to know, what do people want to read about? What do people spend time reading about? All that stuff is part of what you do, right, Nadine?
Yes, and in fact, we did a large job where we kind of revamped our semantic layer just as COVID hit. That wasn't the plan, but we ended up doing that.
Wow.
And also because we are looking at multiple newspapers together because they share content, it's been really interesting to see it and how important it was to set up that foundation in advance and setting it up right. We spent we even though we did it very quickly, we had a very good team that was able to do it really well. And so when COVID did hit, we didn't have, I would say, we didn't suffer a lot from not being able to do the same analysis as we would if COVID didn't. So we were in a good spot, I would say.
Yeah, and in that industry, again, talk about media,
Yeah.
to kind of explain for our audience, semantics is so important. Ontologies, for example, kind of help us understand hierarchies, understand arenas of topics, and figure out, quite frankly, what's interesting and what isn't. I mean, we're seeing data science and journalism more and more intersect. And I think that's fantastic news, quite frankly, because a lot of a journalist's job is just cherry picking, is saying, oh, I want to talk about this, I want to talk about that. But I really think we need to be much more focused on data-driven journalism. Maybe one last question to you before the break, Nadine. What do you think about that? Really relying more heavily on user data, on trends data to guide the editorial process so that as an organization that you're focused on what matters. What do you think?
I totally believe in that. And the newsroom has really embraced the data. They've been very interested in seeing how certain content is resonating with readers, and how it's driving subscriptions on top of that. We have a paywall, so we also can see what was the last item they read before they got the alert to say, okay, now you got to subscribe. So things like that. It's really helping the newsroom to understand what is driving those subscriptions.
Yeah, and that's great news, folks, because this is a new reality. We could talk all day about pop-ups and the history of ads online and click-through rates and all this stuff and click farms. It's a very complex world out there for media, but people want news. I want news. Everybody wants news. So we need to keep this around. Well, don't touch that dial, folks. We'll be right back. You are listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, welcome back once again to DM Radio. We're talking with several experts today, including my good buddy Scott Taylor, the data whisperer, who doesn't whisper much. That's just his moniker. And we've got Nadine Francis, kind enough to join us from the Toronto Star up in Canada. She says it's not cold today. That's a good sign. I'm in Pittsburgh, south of her, and it is cold. So I'm a little tired of the cold. But we have Peggy Tsai coming up next, actually, from a company called Big ID. Very, very cool company doing some fantastic work that I think is much needed in the business. So Peggy, tell us a bit about yourself and your company and how you're helping companies go from crawl to walk to run to fly with their data.
Thanks, Eric, for having me today. It's great to be here with Scott and Nadine. So I'm the Chief Data Officer for Big ID. We are a AI machine learning data discovery platform. So what we do is the ability to automatically connect to all your unstructured, structured, cloud, on-prem, basically all types of data sources and data types that you may have on your premise or that the organization owns. And automatically being able to understand what those data assets are, be able to classify it, and get those data insights in place, right? So what we're able to do is for organizations to build out their catalog, which is an inventory of all the information they own, build out a business glossary, which is what I call the semantic or logical layer of the business terms, and then be able to do specific applications on top of that that range from privacy, DSAR compliance, privacy impact assessments, to security, and then to my favorite topic, which is data governance. So stewarding and data quality, and we're looking into data lineage. And how we're really helping customers accelerate their data management program is that we're doing a lot of things automatically for them. We take a data-driven up approach. A lot of data governance tools out there rely on a top-down approach, like almost like a curation process, a manual curation process to understand and document what all their data assets are. But we do it from the opposite direction, right? Looking directly at the data, be able to provide what we think are the business attributes and just have it validated by the data stewards. And we also provide cool insights, like what are the duplications and similarities across your data silos, and we'll be able to identify things like what your data quality outliers are. And ultimately, the purpose here is do things faster and better with machine learning together with the data steward.
That sounds fantastic. And in the pre-call, we were talking about Big ID and what you're working on. You said something that got me very excited. You talked about how when you deploy, typically teams from across the company will work with you to analyze the data, to classify the data, to look, as you suggest, for data lineage. And you mentioned the data governance teams, the security people, and also the analytics folks. And that's fantastic news, because I got to tell you, folks, most of the time in large organizations and even small, mid-sized companies, you would have completely separate groups focused on these different tasks, certainly for security. But we're now seeing security and governance, even data governance, becoming much more intertwined, which is the way it should be, because it's typically the data you're trying to protect. I mean, the systems as well. Sometimes hackers come in and you do ransomware, things of that nature, but you're protecting the data and the systems. And why wouldn't that be a collaborative effort? So I think you folks are really onto something, and I'm glad that the industry seems to kind of figure this out. But is that your impression too, that we're moving in the positive direction of more collaboration and less discrete silos of processing and teams and so forth? What do you think?
Absolutely. I see it, especially in the last couple of years that I joined Big ID, a lot of convergence and overlaps between data teams and privacy teams, as well as with security teams. And really, you need all three at least to be, and plus legal compliance and risk, right, to be working with us. But we don't, in any organization, you don't want to be building three different data catalogs, three different processes of identifying sensitive and confidential information. And that's where data governance has problems, right? Because your reports, your external reports and analysis is going to show three different answers, because depending on who you're asking. But if you have consistency and one single source of truth, I would say at the very beginning, then it would be really a big benefit. Now I see data governance teams owning privacy compliance. I also see security teams owning data governance as well as a function. So, these type of organizational hierarchies are really dependent on the culture of the organization, but any type of overlaps and collaboration amongst those three, I think is a great step forward.
Yeah, and if you can agree to work from the same data set, then that solves one huge problem. And I think the end result is you wind up having much more meaningful conversations. Instead of debating over what the number is, you can talk about why the number is that way and what we can do about it. And that's where the business value comes. I mean, we talked earlier about automation, and really the more of this stuff you can automate, the better, because once it's automated, then you can start seeing the big picture of what's really happening, and you can start taking some actions. If it's not automated, you're spending all day doing manual, tedious grunt work that is very bad on morale and doesn't have a lot of value to the business. So people wind up getting burned out. We're in the middle of this great resignation right now. I will bet you that a significant portion, if not even as much as half, of people who are walking away from jobs are doing that because there are too many manual processes, boring things that people don't want to do. What do you think, Peggy?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of the the automation that I'm talking about, especially in data management, are the repetitive ones that can be automated through rules. So a lot of the cleansing and the data matching that Scott mentioned earlier. And I think there's a big misconception about having one single source of truth. And I just want to clarify that for the audience, Eric. And the people think that if you only have one single source of truth, then everything has to be equalized and standardized across the organization. That's true to some extent, but I think a good architecture will allow for differences in finance having one definition, the legal team having one definition. You want to enable, as well as your different lines of business, to work with one single source of truth, but also be able to define things that is important to them and in their way. And you have to recognize that there can be multiple ways of defining things, like calculating metrics, or what people consider like customer last billing date could be different from the marketing team versus the actual billing team. So in order to accommodate for that, you need the single source of truth to be able to have that flexibility in defining things. And if you make that a very flexible, agile architecture, you're going to be able to accommodate all the variations and be able to flex with the data management needs in your organization.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you also mentioned focusing on lineage. So just to explain to our audience out there, lineage means, where did this data come from? Did it come from a third party? Did it come from our customer database, for example? Where it came from, when it came from, who touched it along the way? These are all critical data points for data governance, right? If you don't know those things, you don't really have a lot of data governance, right? But the key, I think, is to learn from that process. So when you nail lineage, you'll find out, the data we keep getting from this one system seems to be off. Why is that? You start looking into it, you figure out, there's a filter in place, or we forgot to map this field. I mean, there are all kinds of little steps that can be mistaken along the way that have error propagation spinning up down the road, causing all kinds of issues. So to have teams really focused on that. And the key, again, is to have this sort of marshaling area, because if you're managing different definitions in multiple places, that's going to be very challenging, especially for new people, but it's going to be challenging for the team to understand what things really mean. Right, Peggy?
No, absolutely. All my customers talk to me about data lineage, right? As you said, our lineage is important because are you creating a report? Are you doing the analysis from the authoritative source, right? And then also understanding the impact analysis, right? If the source data changes, what else needs to be changed? And that actually takes up the most amount of time in terms of having conversations, meetings, or emails, just to understand if you change the format, the data type of one cell, oh my goodness, what other types of reports will be impacted by that?
That's
because
right.
It's not going to show the same amount of decimal places. So that really is a real world example in terms of where not just data quality, but from a data lineage perspective. And there's two types of, when I think about data lineage, it's lineage from a business process perspective and also a technical data lineage. So it's really important to understand when I'm speaking to someone, what exactly they mean by data lineage. And really the challenges of data lineage is that there's so much data, first of all, and then second of all, data is stored in so many different environments. You're talking about your QA, all your non-production environments, your test environments, and your production environments, and then all the reports, dashboards, applications that propagate that data, right? So being able to create that extensive spider web of where data moves and how it transforms across the organization is so challenging. And then this is where the fly comes in, right? I think the run and fly, this is where you do need automation to kind of understand and be able to help predict directionality of data and not rely on people like myself in the past who literally had to just document in a Visio diagram where data is. And it's time consuming, it gets outdated really quickly. You do it once for an audit, and then 1 month later, it's outdated. So you're gonna have to redo it again. And do you really want to be spinning your wheels and spending all your time documenting?
Right.
No, you want to do fun stuff in data governance. So
That's right. That's such an excellent point. We have a great point from someone in our studio audience here who writes that people are walking away from jobs because governance and security teams can't agree on strategies as well. And that leads to frustration. I talk all the time about the importance of morale in organizations. And I believe when a person is charged with a particular responsibility and they feel they have the tools, they have the equipment, they have the data that they need, and they can get the job done, that's very rewarding. People like that. People like knowing that they're getting things done. I think it's a very small percentage of people who really want to cause mischief. The problem is that a lot of times you don't have the tools. And kind of to one of your points, Peggy, and I'll throw this to you and then maybe over to Nadine and Scott, we're really getting somewhere with issues like impact analysis. If you have the right technologies, you can load the platform, whatever you're using, and say, okay, what if I change this field? You'll be able to see where you're going to impact people downstream. Typically, how is that going to change things downstream? Oh, you get alerts that's going to break this report. It's going to cause trouble here, et cetera. That helps people understand the big picture of how this all weaves together, right? Because it's very easy to lose the forest for the trees. It's also easy to just get lost in the forest sometimes. But I think, Peggy, I'll throw it back to you real quick. This ability to do impact analysis is very powerful, and we're finally there. What do you think?
I hope we're finally there. I mean, certainly I've been doing it for the last 10 years on impact analysis. And there's certainly a lot of tools and new ways of leveraging machine learning, right? Where looking at large sets of data, being able to understand the data, looking at and having machines look at the data values itself, and be doing some improving the way I think data lineage can be expanded today. And one area that I think is really fascinating, and this is completely greenfield here, is lineage on your unstructured data. It's something that actually most organizations have not considered, because lineage, for the most part, is ETLs and looking at ETL transformations, which is structured and on your relational databases and possibly on your cloud environments as well, understanding that lineage. But being able to see where it actually lands in your unstructured data and has it actually changed values. So there's a lot of correlation between lineage and data quality, and it all kind of weaves in together. But ultimately, at the end of the day, yes, that's what a data steward, your business analyst wants to understand quickly. And that's where organizations, as I said earlier, spend a lot of their time spinning their wheels, not really understanding the full impact of changes in their data tables or technology. I've had technology teams suddenly create a new schema table and everything had to be redirected, right? So lots of things can happen, and that's where having a good understanding, a strong data governance program with lineage is so important for any organization, regardless of size or industry.
Yeah, and Peggy just used a magic word there. We can pick this up on our next segment and maybe the podcast bonus segment as well. Data steward. So this is a job, I'm going to guess about 7-8 years ago, started to become prominent, and now it's everywhere, and it's a brilliant job. So just to help the audience understand, in large organizations, especially now, you have a lot of data engineers. These are the people at the coal face, as they say, who are looking at systems, trying to develop data pipelines to get it moved from here to there in time. That's a fairly technical role. You have people even underneath that working on performance or deploying technology. But then as you get towards the business side, the data stewards live between the data engineers and the business people. So they're the folks who are really supposed to understand both what the business does and what's important, but also how the information landscape works. What is your architecture like? What's possible? What's not possible? Really, really important job. Very good job to train for folks, because there's going to be no end of that job in sight. But don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, we're talking all things data management: crawl, walk, run, fly, modern data management. And a data management show about flying wouldn't be right without a brief discussion of data mesh. We've got Peggy Tsai from Big ID, Scott Taylor from The Data Whisperer, and Nadine Francis from Toronto Star Online Today. Danielle Oberdier of Dakayo Data in the background, live tweeting. But Peggy, I'll throw it over to you. Data mesh, fascinating concept. It's getting a lot of attention right now. It's basically self-service. There's a few different tenets. Self-service is one. The fact that departments can kind of own and manage their own environments is another. And then computation, ideally, is also going to be governed by this process, which is kind of interesting and kind of helps with cost containment and kind of understanding what you're really investing. What are your thoughts on data mesh, where it's going and why it matters?
Yeah, I think that the really data mesh and data fabric, those are really a lot of the trendiest words right now in data management. And I think the concept of data mesh is really giving that ownership, like the data ownership, directly back to the business, right? So that's certainly one concept that resonates a lot with large enterprises. And the second piece is the fact that now that, in the past, when data management was being done, it was more on from a technology perspective. You could govern and own one table, one schema, one database. But that concept is really so fixed that it really doesn't need to exist like that anymore, because you look at an organization that probably, for example, we'll take customer domain, for example. It's not just stored in one singular place. You're going to have customer data, transactional data around customers, all the interactions and information, history about a customer in multiple places, right? So if the business owner wants to be able to have that ownership and be able to offer things like self-service on customer data, they're going to want to own the customer domain and in one place. So the concept is now that data doesn't have to be fixed. You can transcend it into this virtual layer so that data is domain-based. And you give that ownership directly to the owners, the business owner, so that they can, one, maintain the quality of it, make sure that it's good fit for use for their end consumers, and then build upon additional technology things like self-service and reporting and keeping all that. So really, there's a lot of benefits of data mesh, but the challenge, though, Eric, is actually how to transform existing architectures so that it fits into a data mesh architecture. And I think that's where it's going to take some time for organizations to fully to get there. So right now, I think it's a lot of the crawl and walk stage, and then I'm sure we'll quickly see it in the run and fly stage very soon.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You made a couple of good points there. One, for example, talking about the customer and the customer domain, because you're right that it touches multiple different areas of the business. And maybe Nadine, I'll bring you back in just to kind of comment on this and get your thoughts on data mesh. But I think Peggy really hit the nail on the head there and talking about how it used to be that one person owned this database and they were responsible for it. And it's not that that's going away, but the point is it is a fairly archaic way of looking at the environment. And the company that sponsored the airside event we keep talking about, Okira, they do this dynamic provisioning of access to analytics based upon not just your role, but your history, the nature of the data, et cetera. These are better and better guardrails putting in place that they're going to help us get there. But what do you think about data mesh? Is that in the fly phase for you guys, or what do you think, Nadine?
So in our case, it's kind of, well, because we started off by everyone being segregated and like they owned similar data, similar platforms, but they were all doing their own thing. And so what we did was we consolidated everything into one spot, and made that the responsibility of the data analytics department. And then we created what they needed based on their needs. So for us, if we were to go one step further, it would be to actually give more ownership to the departments themselves to build their own reports, which we haven't gotten to that part yet. We're still, because they seem to be happy with just working on their own thing, like reporters don't want to build reports, they want to report. So so we're at a point where, but there are other departments we've been having discussions with, for example, finance, who they create reports all the time. So at some point, maybe there will be an opportunity to provide a area for them to create reports based on the data that we have. So I think for certain departments in our company that would work, and for others they just don't want that similar access. So we'll have to, we're just plain going as seeing how it works. So,
yeah, no doubt. That's the way you should do it, quite frankly. And Scott Taylor, I'll bring you back in, the data whisperer. I mean, you talk all about master data management, right? Master data plays a significant role, it seems to me, in data mesh. If you're trying to understand different domains, the master data is always what kind of connects these things together, right? That's the whole point of having good master data. I refer to it as a way to virtually reconcile information systems, because we tried with the data warehouse to push it all into one place. And then we didn't learn that lesson and did the same thing with the data lake, is push it all in one place. And then, of course, we're like, oh, no, we have too much data in here. We can't make sense of it, right? But I think that the data mesh is bringing some fairly practical components to the picture here of trying to find ways to reasonably manage these environments and let the domains run their own world, right? Because they're the ones who understand it the best. I think that's one of the main tenets, at least. But what are your thoughts, real quick, Scott?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope it works. I think, I've been listening to the story of data mesh, data fabric, this kind of battle for vision out there. We actually used a data fabric softener on our data mesh, and it eased the implementation. So there's a tip for you. But it seems like data mesh has taken on almost a theological patina. It's turned into almost a belief system. And if you watch the meshies, as I like to affectionately refer to them, they get really passionate and almost zealot-like around some of the core principles of their high priestess Samak out there. But, if you mentioned those 3 principles of data mesh, and I've listened to her, I've watched this stuff, I'm looking at what's going on. There was a mention that on the second draft of the data mesh principles, they added a 4th one, which was federated governance, the need for standards, the need for unique IDs. I go, hello. If you'd asked me, that would have been right up there. So no matter what, whether it's a analytics, graph hub, fabric mesh, whatever we're calling the latest thing that's going to take care of all these problems we've always had in our data journey, you still need that foundation. If you don't have common definitions, if you don't have hierarchies that everybody can agree to, if you don't have categorization and some kind of structure around your segmentation, if you don't have proper geography, okay, and unique identification of entities, then none of that stuff, I don't care how many books and webinars you do, is going to work. And whatever it takes, so my feeling is whatever it's going to take for an organization to believe that that's important, great. All speed to them to make it work. But you still have to get there. You cannot fly unless you crawl first.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. And we're almost out of time here, but maybe I'll throw this one over to Nadine, because we've been talking about classifying and governance and data catalogs. Do you folks have an actual data catalog? Is that part of the semantic layer, or what are your thoughts on that?
We do have a catalog. I would say that it's something. It's a evolving catalog, because as a news organization, there's so much new things coming up. So sure. That's a really interesting point. In a way, it's fun because you're at the front end, right? In the media, I think things change more often than they do in just about any other space, because you can get something to come along like COVID, and all of a sudden it goes from 0 to everything, like from 0 to 100 overnight. And it kind of reshapes all the different stories that you write. And it's a never-ending process, but that's the fun part, right? Is when you're in the media. That's and the most important part too is a lot of people forget that we're still an organization that still have other departments like marketing and finance and legal, and all of them have to be involved in this process as well. So it's not just, and sales, right, to sell ads, so right. It's everything's kind of integrated. And I liked what Peggy, you said earlier about the single source of truth, but having multiple ways of defining. That's something we've been actually working on as well, because, you know, finance has a different way of defining what a subscriber is versus marketing. So, you know, those are the things that we work on all the time. So it's part of our governance. So.
And that was a really, really good point too. People forget the media companies are companies. They have different departments. They have all these different roles, just like every other company has. Yes, the reporting is the front end. That's the product or service that you consume. But all that other stuff has to get taken care of. Well, folks, you are listening to DM Radio.